since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly. It was 3 years after the end of World War II and the aftermath of what we've come to term the Holocaust, the atrocities committed by the Nazis during that terrible period of human history. I'm delighted that the Aegis Trust is partnering today with the Embassy of Argentina and, of course, with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. It is a double anniversary because yesterday, the 9th of December, 1948, marks the day in which the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide was also adopted by the UN General Assembly. And if I may, I just want to quote from Raphael Lemkin, the Polish-Jewish lawyer who coined the term genocide. And he wrote much more extensively, not only about the convention, but there was lots of Raphael Lemkin's thinking that wasn't included in the convention. And one of his observations is that fear and impatience in dealing with many of what he called the vexing problems represented by groups of human beings may lead to a temptation of extermination, of a final solution. And a partnership between Aegis Trust and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center has been trying to address this problem of fear in society through a program called the Changemaker Program. And it's based on 3 case studies exploring history of the Holocaust, of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and of apartheid in South Africa. The method is based on storytelling, storytelling of different examples of how individuals during those case studies overcame the division and the hatred and propaganda. The program, the Changemaker Program, is designed to build empathy and critical thinking, and also promote values. And from the experience that's been shared between those working in the Holocaust and in Rwanda, my colleague Freddie Mutangura is on the call today. He's actually in Zimbabwe at the moment with an unstable line, which is why I'm filling in for him at the moment. And experiences from the Holocaust from the Rwanda and South Africa. This is being applied in different places now, where atrocities may happen or where there is division in societies. Looking back at the problems that Raphael Lemkin had observed over decades, centuries, even before the Holocaust. And the program's been applied in North Nigeria, Mozambique, and Gambia, and many other places. Now, it's not about just exporting the experiences from Europe or Rwanda or South Africa. It's sharing those experiences. So similar stories from those communities can be found, shared, the histories addressed in a way that doesn't divide in a way that memory often does, but brings people together in a common purpose. And that's why we're here today, the Aegis Trust, because of our partnership that's been very much driven and spearheaded by Tally Nates. We're all on this wonderful call today because of the passion and energy of Tally. And I'm going to hand over to her, the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Thank you, Tally, for bringing us all together. Welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us for what I know is going to be a very informative and inspiring session. Tally, over to you.
Thank you so much, James. It's wonderful to work together. We do so for many, many years. And we indeed also work together with the Embassy of Argentina for many years. That gives me joy that we are all coming together. And really welcome to all of you from all around South Africa. People are still joining us from all around the world. And it is wonderful to see members of the diplomatic corps, or academics, teachers, colleagues, friends. And for our Jewish friends, I just want to wish a happy Hanukkah, as tonight is the first light of Hanukkah. Today's program is a partnership, as some of you heard already, between the Embassy of Argentina, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, the Center for Genocide Studies at the National University of Febrero, Argentina, and of course, Aegis Trust. And it is important for us to mark the 72nd anniversary of both the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide that was passed on the 9th of December 1948, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed on the 10th of December 1948. And we like to do it critically. We like to challenge ourselves to look at it 70 years later. And there is no one better to challenge us and to really get us thinking about what we think we know, but maybe we should relook at those critical thoughts than the two speakers tonight. And before I introduce our esteemed speakers for tonight, I would like to invite us all to watch a very short video presented to us in Spanish from Argentina, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Argentina, to just start us thinking about those issues. And then I will introduce our speakers.
El 10 de diciembre de 1983 marcó el fin de la dictadura más violenta de nuestra historia y el comienzo de una construcción democrática duradera. Desde aquel día, y gracias a la lucha incansable de nuestras madres y abuelas y los organismos de derechos humanos, nuestro compromiso con la democracia está marcado inexorablemente con la defensa de los derechos humanos. Un largo camino de memoria, verdad y justicia comenzó con la creación de la CONADEP y el juicio a las juntas militares. Nunca más. A pesar de los retrocesos, desde el regreso a la democracia, los derechos humanos avanzaron hasta convertirse en 2003 en política de Estado en Argentina. Hoy, Argentina también impulsa una nueva agenda de derechos humanos. La trágica historia de violaciones masivas y sistemáticas de los derechos humanos tiene como contrapartida un liderazgo internacional en la construcción y la permanencia de numerosos mecanismos regionales e internacionales de protección y promoción de los derechos humanos. Argentina unida para la promoción de los derechos humanos en el mundo, para construir sociedades más justas, inclusivas, solidarias y diversas.
It is now my honor to introduce the Ambassador of Argentina in South Africa, His Excellency Alberto D'Alotto. Ambassador D'Alotto is a career diplomat who served his country, amongst other esteemed positions, at the Argentine Embassy in Washington, Montevideo, and the United Nations in New York. He also served in many different ministries, but relevant to today's talk, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Offices of Human Rights and as Director of Human Rights between 2000 and 2001. He was appointed as Deputy Foreign Minister in 2010-11 and Permanent Representative of Argentina to the International Organization in Geneva between 2012 and 2016. Ambassador D'Alotto was a professor of international public law and human rights at the Faculty of Law of the University of Buenos Aires, of international organizations at the Torquato di Tella University, and recently of Argentine foreign policy in the Master of International Relations at the University of Buenos Aires. Ambassador, you will open in the opening remarks, and after that, I will officially introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Professor Daniel Feierstein. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Tali. Thank you very much to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center for organizing together with us this meeting. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I want to thank all participants, members of NGOs, of the Diplomatic Corps, and all those who are going to participate in this debate. And I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Daniel Feierstein. We don't know each other, but I know him because I follow his articles in the Argentine press and the books he has published, and I think it's going to be a very interesting speech, the one that he's going to give. So this is a time of anniversaries, and I would like to highlight 3 important anniversaries, or 4. The first one, it has been already mentioned, is the 72nd anniversary of the resolution of the General Assembly on the 9th December 1948 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The 10th of December in 1948 was also approved by the G8, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the 10th of December is the day that was chosen by President Alfonsín in Argentina in 1983 to restore democracy in our country. It was his belief that democracy and human rights were inextricably linked, so he chose the 10th of December for the day he assumed power in our country after the dictatorship. And there is another anniversary. This is yesterday, as a matter of fact, it was on the 9th of December of 1985, the 35th anniversary of the trial that condemned to life sentence the dictators that were the responsibles of the most large violation of human rights that our country knew, and that produced, as we all know, torture and disappearances of thousands and thousands of persons in Argentina. So this was a historical event. Now we are celebrating the 35th anniversary of that event, and it was a very important moment in our democracy, and I believe it was the basis on which our democracy has been built. This anniversary resulted in the condemnation of all the members, the principal responsibles of what happened in Argentina in those years. So starting with the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, I am glad that Professor Smith mentioned the Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin. After years of campaigning, he arrived to convince many people to the importance of a convention against genocide, after all what has happened in Europe in the years during the Second World War. This idea of establishing the crime of genocide, defined as the destruction in whole or in part of a national, ethnic, racial or religious groups, was a very important landmark in the history of conventions on human rights. As a matter of fact, this was the first convention that was approved by the General Assembly. Unfortunately, it wasn't approved as Dr. Lemkin thought, because he wanted to include political groups. And I believe if political groups were included in the definition, a different story would have happened in Argentina and in other places of the world. But unfortunately, there were delegations at the time that didn't want to approve the concept of political groups. Now, this convention is customary law. It has been the basis for international tribunals that judge genocides, like the Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia, on Rwanda and Cambodia. And in the case of Argentina, this convention has been included in our constitution, a reform constitution that was approved in 1994. Then we have the Universal Declaration as Lenkin was the lawyer for the Convention of Genocide and the ideologue, I believe, of that convention, the Universal Declaration was, among others, the result of the work of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was actually chairing the drafting committee that prepared this declaration, and Professor René Cassin from France, this great jurist that was also one of those that participated and make extraordinary contributions to this declaration. Today, the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration, is a consensual document. There is no one that at least can dare to challenge the universality of the declaration. But at the time of its approval, not everybody voted in favor of this resolution in the General Assembly. There were some countries, mostly in the communist world of that time, that abstained, and among other countries, South Africa, the South Africa of the apartheid, abstained in the resolution that was approved that year. And then going to Argentina, I would like to mention, I mentioned already the trial of the juntas, but there were many things that I would like to underline. But first of all, if you allow me, I would like to say what initiatives were promoted by our country on the prevention of genocide. Argentina created jointly with Switzerland a network of focal points among different countries to prevent genocide. Also with the Swiss government, we started in 2009 a very fruitful seminars to discuss questions of prevention of genocide and of course other atrocities that were, and these events were carried in Argentina, in Tanzania, in places in Asia, and we ended creating an organization that is called GAMAC, which is the Global Alliance Against Mass Atrocities. That's a network where there is a group of states, including Argentina, and civil society organizations, academic, join as partners. In 2012, the Latin American network was established in Buenos Aires in association with the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. And this network, it was the first type in the world, include the participation of representatives of almost every Latin American country through the development of a common curricula and training workshops on genocide prevention for public officials, defense, armed forces, security forces, and foreign service. Argentina also has played a very important role and a leadership together with France and Japan on the negotiation process of the Convention Against Enforced Disappearances of Persons. This convention entered into force already in 2010 and in 2006, and it was a very important achievement and very important for our country to have this convention that was a long-standing wish of the relatives of the disappeared people. Coming to what is the Argentine state policy against impunity, I have to say that after 37 years of democracy, there is a wide consensus in the Argentina political class and in the society on the importance of struggling against impunity and building an agenda of human rights. There were not important challenges to this consensus. All political parties and civil society agreed on the importance of avoiding impunity and eradicating any kind of impunity in relation with the crimes that have been defined by the international community as crimes against humanity. I would like to highlight that in 2005, for the first time, the branches of the state, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary removed all legal obstacles in order to identify and punish those responsible for such systematic violations of human rights. Argentina continued the path established in 1983 with the return of democracy and the first trials, as I mentioned, we are celebrating 35 years. Since the reopening, there were some events, some governments that want to go backwards on this path, but since the reopening of the trials for crimes against humanity in 2005 until 2019, 962 persons have been convicted in Argentina for crimes against humanity, with different levels of participation, and several sentences in Argentina referred that the mass atrocities were committed within a framework of social genocide practices, where ideology as the cause of the annihilation extended the concept of national group as included in the Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. There have been 238 sentences, 608 detainees under house arrest, and 589 judiciary proceedings pending, and 21 proceedings at oral judgment stage. All this tragic experience suffered in Argentina has been relevant for the advancement of human rights at the international levels in fields like teaching of the Holocaust as a platform for understanding human rights, the institutional capacity building for prevention of mass atrocities, several legal developments on the fight against enforced disappearance, the right to truth, the recovery of identity of abducted children, or the use of forensic genetics in the field of human rights. This state policy was the result of, first, we have to say and to pay tribute to the fight of the relatives of disappeared people. As during the dictatorship, the main resistance to all these atrocities were led by relatives of disappeared people, the mothers and the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and also several NGOs like the Permanent Assembly of Human Rights, the National League of Human Rights, and other organizations that were leading the fight against the dictatorship, claiming for justice and for the end of these atrocities. There were very few in the first years of the dictatorship, but with time this was increasing in numbers, and then result in the mass mobilization that you saw minutes ago in the documentary that was shown to you and was done by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So in Argentina, there is a great sensitivity on these issues. There is very little possibilities of going backwards, and there is a strong political support to all these kind of initiatives. Of course, we know what history is. We can always go backwards, but it is important, like events like this one and many events that are celebrating the International Day of Human Rights today in Argentina, are strengthening our commitment to promote protection, respect, and respect for human rights in our country. So this is what I wanted to say, and I thank you very much for your participation. And I stress and ratify the commitment of our country and our government in this fight, which is also a universal fight for the respect of human rights. And Argentina remains committed to strengthen international institutions worldwide, both in the regional sphere, like in the OAS, or in the UN as the Council of Human Rights and the different treaty bodies, to make life difficult to all those that believe that to keep power, they have to violate the dignity and the essential rights of everybody. So thank you very much to the Johannesburg Holocaust Center, and I keep open to answer any questions if it is necessary. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador D'Alotto, for your words. And we will continue now to develop this theme of human rights and a look from the South, from Latin America, with a an expert in this field. So it is really my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Daniel Feierstein. He holds a PhD in social sciences from the University of Buenos Aires, where he runs the Observatory of State Crimes. He also heads the Center for Genocide Studies at the National University of Tres de Febrero, Argentina, and is a principal researcher at CONICET, National Council of Research in Argentina. He was president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, AIGS, from 2013-2015, and we are very happy that the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center is also a member of that association. He has been a judge of the Permanent People's Tribunal on several cases. Feierstein published dozens of books on genocide studies, mostly in Spanish, but his book, Reorganizing Society Under the Nazis and Argentina's Military Juntas, was translated to English by Rutgers University Press in 2014. His work has been used in dozens of case trials in Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, and Bangladesh. I open the floor to you, Professor Feierstein.
Okay, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to the Johannesburg Center and to the Argentine Embassy and Aegis Trust. And well, the idea today is not only to commemorate or to congratulate ourselves from these 72 years, but my idea is to try to think together critically about what happened in these 72 years and what kind of challenges do we have now. And this idea of the critical thinking is from the Latin American margin. So what we can see from the global South, mainly about the whole situation from 1948 to the present, with a clear mark and differentiation at the end of the Cold War in 1989. So my idea is to take 25-30 minutes to do, I would say, try to think in the whole history of these different moments. So at the beginning, it is interesting to understand the very interesting moment at the end of the Second World War. It was a very particular moment. This post-war was really interesting about the possibility to defeat Nazism and the possibility to understand and to work in the idea that the genociders could be sanctioned, could be judged and punished. And that was really important. That was really a cornerstone of history. And it was because a lot of activists and social movements that were working for decades, but mainly in that decade against Nazism. And when we see the main names in that process, it is interesting because they were victims, they were former victims, they were activists, they were militants, they were members of social movements. The case of Raphael Lemkin is very clear, but we could mention also Hannah Arendt, for example, another very important name in those years, or even Raoul Hilberg, one of the most important scholars in the field of genocide studies, but he was part of the Second World War too. So that was the first moment, the pressure from those militants, activists, social movements to the states, trying to sanction a new element, a convention with the possibility to prevent and punish the genocide. And that convention, the discussion was very interesting during 2 whole years in the United Nations. And as Ambassador D'Alotto said, one of the main elements to understand the convention was the exclusion of the political groups. But that exclusion is not usually, I would say, it's the story that we can hear about that exclusion. I would say this is a half-truth. And it is interesting. And my idea today is to give you some more information that it is not usual now even in the genocide studies field, but mainly in the diplomatic circles. For example, it is very known that finally the political groups were excluded. But what is not really known is that the real votation regarding the political groups after 2 years of debate, the result of that votation is that the political groups were included. So after 2 years of discussion, the vote was done in the session of October 15, 1948, and 29 countries, over 51 members present, approved the inclusion of the political groups. So what happened next? Something very strange in the United Nations. I know there is some members of embassies here, some people, for example, Ambassador D'Alotto, with a lot of experience in United Nations. And I have never heard, probably there are other cases and I don't know them, but I never heard about this situation that a second vote in something that was already voted. That was happened 1 month later in the meeting 198 at November 29th, 1948, in which at the request of 3 countries, Egypt, Iran, and Uruguay, and with the support of the 2 main powers, the session started very late at 8:15 p.m., which is not very common. And at that session, with only 39 members present in the session, this proposal decided to vote again about the question of the political groups. And that was the way in which the political groups were excluded, with 12 members out of the session, with less votes than the votes when it was approved, because it was approved with 29 votes, and they were excluded with 22 votes. So that is the story of the exclusion of the political groups. And that is really important. Why? Because when we analyze a comparative analysis of genocidal social practices all over the world, genocide is always political. There is no genocide in history that has no political reasons. So if we take a very strict approach of the Genocide Convention, it's a useless convention because it wouldn't apply to any case, because even in the cases in which the national or ethnic or racial or religious identity of the group could be very clear, the reasons behind the persecution and annihilation are clearly political. So if the political reasons are out of the question, so the convention is useless. And that was why some of the most important states, and I would say either the Soviet Union and the United States, didn't want a UN Genocide Convention with the inclusion of the political groups, because the role of the United States is very interesting, because the United States supported the inclusion of the political groups while they thought that they were finally excluded. But at the moment, in the session of October, that the groups were included, so the United States changed its policy. And the main declaration in this session of November 29th was supporting the exclusion of the political groups and even pressuring some of the countries to change their vote. taking account that the three countries that proposed the second votation, Uruguay, Iran, and Egypt, were strongly supported and guided by the United States at that moment, 1948. So what happened from that moment to 1989? It was 40 years, 41 years, in which the world had a United Nations Genocide Convention, but no possibility to use it because of that exclusion and because I would say the lack of willing to use this convention. And it was a hard fight from the social movements, from the activists, from the militants, people trying to use this convention that was approved, but was never used during the years of the Cold War. But that is when we are talking about the international arena. But it is interesting, but if we can go to the national level, the existence of the convention was much more important. So we had some cases, and we could say the judgment in absentia from the leaders of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in 1979, which is usually an information that almost doesn't exist in the legal academia. This first very interesting judgment using the Genocide Convention by a national tribunal. Well, the case of our country that Ambassador D'Alotto mentioned, the trial of the juntas in Argentina in 1985, that even if the court decided finally not to use the Genocide Convention that was presented by some of the plaintiffs, for example, Eduardo Garcesat was an Argentine lawyer representing some of the families of the victims, and he presented a file before the court trying to qualify the facts as genocide. So the court decided to reject this because they weren't so willing to use international law, but it was a discussion at the moment anyway, and it was interesting, this very early experience of the possibility of judging the responsible of state crimes after Nazism. We have also the case of Ethiopia and some other few cases. So that was the story in these 40 years. No possibility to use that convention, mainly because this very illegitimate exclusion, and the possibility to use anyway the convention or try to use the convention or the ideas behind the convention in the national courts, national tribunals. So the end of the Cold War changed the balance, changed the situation, but not necessarily for the good. I would say in some things it was for the good. In other things, it was much more problematic because on the one hand, there was a possibility to create some tribunals, and mainly some international tribunals, to judge the perpetrators of state crimes. And the two more known cases, two main cases, are the two ad hoc tribunals created by United Nations, the tribunal on the former Yugoslavia and the tribunal on Rwanda. And that was the 90s, and that was the possibility to use the different elements created in the international law, mainly the UN Genocide Convention, also the Convention on Crimes Against, not the convention, but the Convention on the Non-Prescriptibility of the Crimes Against Humanity of 1969. So that was the situation in the international arena, the possibility to create the tribunals, even the creation of the International Criminal Court, even if it was almost as useful as the Genocide Convention in those 40 years, because the International Criminal Court in more than 20 years of existence has punished, I guess it is 4 cases. So it is interesting in comparison with the numbers that Ambassador D'Alotto was sharing regarding only one country, which is Argentina, in which in 20 years, in the same, somehow the same period, even some years less, we have judged around 1,000, punished around 1,000 people in 250 cases somehow. So that was one element. The second is the profusion, I would say, the lot of opening of cases in national tribunals that, again, they're not as known as the international tribunals are. But we have not only the case of Argentina as an exception. Of course, the case of Argentina is very interesting regarding the use of the tribunals that already existed before the facts, the level of respect to the principles of the law, the number of cases, the number of people punished. But it's not the only case at all. We can include the case of Chile. We can include the case of the courts in Bangladesh. We can include the national courts of Bosnia-Herzegovina. We can include the mixed tribunal in Cambodia and also the mixed tribunal in Sierra Leone. We can include some cases really arguable, but I would say a dozen of cases in Colombia by the national courts. We have also a couple of cases in Uruguay and another couple of cases in Mexico. And probably I'm forgetting some other cases or even some experiences in Africa and of course the experience of the gachacha in Rwanda. So we have, at the same time, we have this international tribunal. We have a lot of national tribunals trying to understand the international law and trying to even improve that international law. And one, in my opinion, one very important point was this analysis of the Argentine tribunals during 2006, 2007, 8, 10, 12, in different courts, different tribunals and different cases, trying to understand this idea of the national group as a possibility to include all different groups of the population as the core of the genocidal project. So the possibility to use the Genocide Convention, even in these cases that I would say from the strict interpretation of the Genocide Convention couldn't be used. And this jurisprudence was used also in Bangladesh, and it has been used in some of the votes by the Cambodian judges in the mixed tribunal, and it has been used in Colombia, and it's being used in some discussions and debates in courts in Chile. So that was the situation in the legal arena. But at the same time, I would say that one important change is that the people who work in human rights and genocide studies and state crimes also changed. What we saw in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, even in the 70s and the 80s, is that the people who work in human rights were mainly members of social movements and activists, and they were trying to mix the activisms with the academia. And in South Africa, you have a very nice example, which is one of the main scholars in the genocide studies field, which is Leo Cooper. Leo Cooper was an activist against the apartheid, and he was an activist in many battles on human rights. And he was at the same time one of the real pioneers of the genocide studies field. I would say that after Lemkin and Arendt, then we have Hilbert, and then we have Cooper. Leo Cooper is one of the main names in the field. So that situation after the end of the Cold War also changed. And what we have now is a lot of foundations concerned not necessarily with human rights and with the fight of human rights, but I would say in a very provocative way, trying to produce a debate in our question and answer sessions, trying to change the core of the concern from the respect of the human rights and the possibility to judge and sanction and punish the perpetrators. That was the main idea behind the 40s and 50s and 60s and Genocide Convention, and the possibility to create tribunals and even people tribunals, as the permanent people's tribunals, all the tribunal of Cambodia. It was slightly changed to the idea that the main question is sovereignty and intervention. So that the main question in human rights is when and how and where we should intervene militarily to stop not only genocide, but a very broad and open concept, which is atrocity crimes. That was very problematic, particularly when we see this change from the global South, because no one is proposing to intervene in the United States or Russia or China or France or the United Kingdom, but the intervention is always in the global South. And not astonishingly, in places in which there are important resources, mainly oil, sometimes geopolitical interests. So the argument of the human rights that was the main argument of the activists and the social movements during these 40 years from the end of the Second World War and the end of the Cold War, it was changed from this idea of an analytical intervention guided by scholars who are no more activists, they are no more members of social movements, but they are financed by companies, mainly, sometimes by states or by foundations supported by states, and with the idea to decide where should we intervene militarily. And that was behind this change from the concern on human rights, genocide, and the possibility to judge, sanction, punish the perpetrators, to this idea of responsibility to protect that was created 2004, 2005, approved by the United Nations. The decision to intervene in some countries, that the main problem for persecuting genocide is sovereignty. And the sovereignty should be, I would say, should be surpassed when the situation of human rights challenge this question of sovereignty. But the problem is who decides? Who decides where the intervention should be done? And we have some examples, very worrying, I would say, particularly the use of the responsibility to protect to justify the intervention in Libya in 2011, the assassination of the leader of Libya and their family, and the situation in Libya from 2011 to now, which has not improved at all, but on the contrary, it has worsened after the intervention, because the intervention destroyed the difficult equilibrium and balance in the power in Libya. And I would say that the same idea was again in the case of Syria. And that talking with the Johannesburg Center and talking in Africa, in South Africa, it's interesting also to take into account that the International Criminal Court has taken mainly African cases. It was very problematic, and some African countries decided to put the question that it is an international criminal court or it is an international criminal court for Africa. So what happened with the violation of human rights in other countries? What happened with the state crimes committed outside Africa? It is out of the scope of the International Criminal Court. So that was the change, and it is interesting because on the one hand, we have a possibility to use the concepts developed in the international criminal law. That was interesting because during 40 years, these instruments haven't been used unless some little national tribunals, like the case of Cambodia or Argentina or some others. But on the other hand, we have this change, this turning point in the main concerns and the importance of the idea of the intervention and the connection with some forms which I would call neo-colonialism, which is a way to have the human rights as an excuse to intervene in countries in which there are some interests regarding their resources. And it is interesting when we compare, I have published a work in the Journal of the International Association of Genocide Studies last year, trying to compare the level of victimization in different countries, the level of victims of state crimes in different countries, and the level of concern of the international bodies and also in the academia in different countries, and the statements and whatever. And it is interesting because there is no correlation. It is not true that the international community are more worried about the cases which have more victims, but the international community are worried about the cases which are in the international press. And the cases which are in the international press, I would say, not astonishingly, are the cases in which there are resources that are being in debate. Yeah. It is interesting to compare. It's not false that in those countries there are some violation of human rights. It is true, as in many countries all over the world. But the question is, who select which countries are in the top of concern? And why is the reason they are in the top of our concerns? So that's my main concern regarding 72 years later, after the sanction of these very important instruments like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the United Nations Genocide Convention, two really important instruments and fundamental instruments of international criminal law. But to take into account these 72 years to see critically where we are today. And I think it is different when we see it from the global north or when we see it from the global south. So the situation in the global north is that we have more and more group of studies, more and more scholarly production, which is okay, which is great. But it is interesting because most of the production in the global north is about the global south. So the production in the global north is not about the state crimes committed in the global north, which are quite important, but it is about the state crimes committed in the global south. And this work is being done by scholars which are not mainly activists, which are not connected with social movements in their countries. I would say, generally speaking, of course, there are members, but generally speaking, there are no more. It is not the case like it was in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. And they are mainly financed more and more by different foundations with interest in the resources in different countries and by state funds. On the other hand, we have the situation in the global south, which is, I would say, more contradictory, because we continue having a lot of social movements working for justice. And Ambassador D'Alotto mentioned the case of Argentina, which is non-understandable without the incredible effort of the different social movements trying to bring justice to the victims. But I would say it is the case also in Chile, and it was the case in Bangladesh, and it was the case in Colombia, and it is being the case in Colombia, or even in Mexico, or in some other countries. And it is interesting because most of these works are intertwined, yet still, I would say, are intertwined, as it was in the global north in the past, is intertwined between the social movements and the academia. And it is mainly focused in processes in their own countries. So the main focus of the studies in Argentina are about Argentina, and in Colombia are about Colombia, in Mexico are about Mexico, even if there are some links and trying to work together with the situation in the different cases. Anyway, this international trend is growing even in the global south. So, and that's interesting. I used to say that there is a kind of redirection of the human rights, and that was happened at the end of the Cold War. That until the end of the Cold War, the human rights, even if they were used by the powers anyway, but mainly the core of the human rights was the denunciation of different situations. And of course, you can take some situation instead of the other regarding in which block the denouncers were, but anyway, the core was the denunciation of the violation of human rights. But I would say after the end of the Cold War, this was the kind of redirection of human rights and the possibility to use human rights as an excuse for something else, as an excuse for the intervention. That before the end of the Cold War, it was mainly the fight in the Cold War. So the idea of the intervention was the fight against communism or the fight against capitalism. And then in the immediate years after the Cold War, it was mainly the fight against terrorism. But I would say in the 21st century, this idea that the human rights are a very good excuse for working regarding the sovereignty of the states, to working against the Westphalia Treaty, and to change the agreements of the international community for some centuries, well, that's a situation that from the global south, we should be at least aware of and trying to think critically about the possible consequences we have seen, for example, in Libya, and the consequences we could see, for example, in some Latin American countries or in some African countries regarding this situation. Okay, so it is somehow half an hour, which I have compromised. So the idea is to put these very provocative and difficult questions in a critical analysis of these 72 years to open the possibility to debate and to think together. So thank you very much again for the invitation. And I'm really glad and it's a pleasure being with you.
Thank you so much, Professor Feierstein, for a very, as you said, provocative, very interesting, very informative discussion. And quite rightly, the next sort of 20 minutes we want to spend having a discussion, having a conversation, and posing questions to the professor or some of our other guests. So please, will you just make use of the chat? You can write down your questions there. If you would like to unmute and pose the question directly to the speakers, just make a note of that in the chat and just say, please, can I unmute and I have a question, and I'm sure we can facilitate that as well. So what I would like to start, Professor, is if you could just, while people are gathering their thoughts and writing their questions, could you reflect on 2 examples for us? So the first is the lack of intervention in the DRC. It's an example of the global South. And then, of course, the situation that is ongoing in Armenia and Azerbaijan, that's sort of ongoing right now. Perhaps if you could reflect on those 2 examples for us, that would be really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think I'm not an expert on any case, and I don't like to talk very much in cases I don't know in detail, but I could say something about it, which is in the line I was trying to open to the debate, particularly, for example, in the case of the DRC, which is why the discussion is on Libya or even now in Venezuela and not in the DRC. And that's my point, that the decision is not concerned with the seriousness of the situation. And the second element is trying to understand that the military intervention usually is quite problematic. And what we have seen is that unless the intervention is done only and mainly to create a safe corridor, trying to save people, if the intervention is trying to influence in the conflict, there are some studies that can show how this kind of intervention can produce even more victims, because sometimes you're balancing a conflict, so you have the possibility to create conflict with more duration, with more time. So this is really problematic, and I think that's why the main concern of the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the possibility to create some kind of political and diplomatic intervention and some kind of possibility to judge and punish the perpetrators at any moment in time. That could be a way to prevent. And we have some interventions in Latin America during the first decade of the 21st century that were really interesting, but because they were not military intervention, but agreement of the head of states, of different states, trying to create some kind of boycotts or some kind of dialogue in the situation. So, for example, in the case of Bolivia, it was quite important in the previous situation, not in the current coup d'etat that luckily finished, but in the previous situation, in the massacre of Pando, the intervention of the Union of Latin American countries was quite important. And again, in the case of the attempt of the coup d'etat in Ecuador in 2009, and we have even the possibility to intervene in Honduras, which was really important, the role of Brazil at that moment. But unfortunately, the lack of support of the US was a real problem trying to manage the situation in Honduras. And now we can say that the situation in Honduras for the last 10 years is one of the worst situations in our continent. So that was my main point. Then regarding the current conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan or the DRC, not the place in which I have real fieldwork or connection with the social movements and the people in the field. And as I said, I don't like to be an an expert saying everything about everything. So I think that's not the way in which we should work, and we should talk about the cases we really know, not about some statements, but a real connection in the field with the movements. And that's what we do, or I have done, for example, with the Permanent People's Tribunal, which is a possibility to meet with different social movements in the field, trying to work, asking to the different offices of the government, asking to the different political parties, trying to understand the situation, trying to work together. So, but it needs a lot of information, trying to manage very carefully the conflicts, because I insist, this idea that you could manage the conflicts from the outside and through military intervention usually makes more harm than good.
Thank you for that answer. I think you might then have a similar answer for Mr. Wabini. I apologize if I've pronounced that incorrectly. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself? But I think it's a really interesting case that you bring forward, and perhaps other people can comment on that as well. So would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Vin, and I'm from United States in North Carolina. Actually, I was born in the Central Highlands in Vietnam, and I have been living before, during, and after the Vietnam War, and I was trained as a medical professional back in Vietnam. And because political reason, and then now I escaped and refugee, and now I'm in America. And I'm very interested to study about this topic about the genocide, saying I look the countries, and I try to understanding what's happened to us in Vietnam, war, colonialism, and now it's called communism. And I believe that we no longer exist, because this is something happen, go beyond our ability to survive. So then I try to study all from the genocide literature, and then to help me to understanding what is happen, both in the communist, capitalist, and when we are owner of the land. Now we lost everything, so I come up, and I'm glad now I have this question, because the many long story I will present maybe one day, one time with all of you. But on this question I have seen about the children now, we lost all our language. And then when I come up with this country, many big countries like America, United States nation, I visited the United States nation last year about and I submit some my question, but nobody answered because I am really small position. So now I have a question: why the part of Article 2 and Part E forcibly transferring children from the group to another group? That is happened in Australia, in the Indian America, and while we are there is different form. The Vietnamese flooded in our village, every place, every corner to living, and then the authority put it high speaker volume, every corner speak in, they try to eradicate our identity, language, whatever. So when talk about Particle E with the United Nations, they say that it's act of common genocide. But how we translate our problem like here? That is my question.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. And again, I don't know the situation of the Diga people in Vietnam. I haven't heard anything about that until today, but I could say some things about the Genocide Convention, and particularly the Article 2E, which is quite important, because what we have said today is the main problem of the Genocide Convention, which is the exclusion of the political groups. But we have not said one of the most important elements of the convention, which is really amazing, particularly this conception by Lemkin that was taken in the convention, that genocide is not mainly a destruction of a group, but it's the intention to destroy the identity of the group. That is fundamental. The genocide is directed against the identity, and the identity of the whole group, destroying some parts of the group. And the 5 clauses, the Article 2, A, B, C, D, E, the 5 clauses are the 5 ways in which you can destroy an identity. And that's really amazing. That's really very, very thorough understanding of what genocide is. Because even the 3 scholars that prepared the draft of the convention, they included only 4 ways, the clauses A, B, C, and D. And it was the representative from Venezuela that proposed in the discussion in the assembly, the clause E, which is the forcible transfer of children, which is a fundamental way to destroy the identity of a people. And we can see in some indigenous peoples in different countries, and maybe it is the case in Cambodia too. We can see it in Canada, in the US, in Australia, even in Argentina. And we have seen also this practice in our countries in the genocide in the 70s, kidnapping the children of some political groups and taking their identity. And it was the same in tens of thousands of cases in Spain under Franco. So of course, this clause 2E of the Genocide Convention is the particular importance. And it is one of the main ways in which you can destroy the identity of a group of people, even if you are not killing the members of the group. So that was the general understanding. That was what I can answer you. I can't give you a real answer on the situation because I would need to study it before talking about it. But thank you very much for your intervention.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that question and for raising that topic for us. Are there any more questions from the group? Anybody want to put a question forward to any of the speakers tonight? Please don't be shy. Talia, are you raising your hand?
Yes, yes. I want to bring it, maybe James or Daniel, to the impact of COVID-19 on the issue of human rights. And I think we cannot be here at the end of 2020 without asking you to reflect on it.
Talia, I can give one response just from the personal experience of Aegis Trust. It's had a major impact. Of course, not only on our operations in Rwanda, but with lack of travel, international visitors, the training that happens around the country. Although Rwanda has controlled COVID very well, it's been a challenge to undertake the training. Even more so in Central African Republic, where they're, aside from COVID, we're in pre-election period there. We've had to suspend some of the peace education training at a time where it's most needed ahead of the elections, partly because COVID-19 led to all sorts of tensions in the communities, which made it unsafe for the peace practitioners to stay, particularly in the western part of Central African Republic, where we had one of the programs. And so that is, on hold, first of all, until things settle down with COVID, and then after the elections. So just at a time, and I'm sure this is not a unique experience, that this must be being applied, to numerous programs all around the world, where COVID's had, quite an impact on either slowing down programs or heightening tensions in communities.
Yeah, I have some contradictory views about the connection between COVID-19 and genocide, because on the one hand, what we have seen all over the world is that in societies where the notion of community is stronger, the possibility to fight against the pandemic was easier. And we can see it mainly in the East, in Eastern societies, but also we can see it in Australia or New Zealand or even Scandinavia. And in societies in which the attacks to this sense of community has been really hard, it was quite difficult for the society to understand the importance of the norms of cooperation. So it was not possible to keep the people 15 days without movement, which is what we need to control the pandemic. And it was the case in the States and in most of Western Europe and in most of Latin America. I don't know how exactly it is the situation in Africa, because it is interesting that Africa has some different figures, but we are not clear about what those figures mean. And it is different even from South Africa and the center of Africa. But on the other hand, that is one thing. But on the other hand, the pandemic was an opportunity for authoritarian governments to increase the violation of human rights with a very good excuse, because as we say, we need to stay without movement at least for 15, 20 days. But it was the opportunity for the security forces or the military forces to take the streets. And for example, in cases like Colombia, but I would say Mexico, but I would say almost all Latin American countries, even in Argentina, it was quite problematic. So, and we had more human rights violation regarding this presence of the security forces or military forces in the streets. So it is a contradictory view, because on the one hand, we need some organization and we need some communitarian response to the pandemic. On the other hand, the organization of this communitarian response could involve more human rights violation, and how to manage this balance is particularly problematic, at least in our region. It's really problematic because we need more organization, we need more possibility to understand the need to follow the cooperation norms, but at the same time, we need more control to the security forces and military forces regarding the possibility to produce more human rights violations. So I have this contradictory view at the moment, and I'm working a lot now in my country regarding trying to, with different disciplines and different scientists and scholars, trying to work in different aspects of the pandemic, because we are living a very worrying situation quite now, and a lot of deaths and an uncontrolled situation, as you are living also in the different countries, particularly in the countries we are living, or most of us.
Thank you. Any final questions from anybody? I might not see you if you're putting your hand up, so just unmute if you'd like to ask a question. Okay. Any final comments or closing comments from Professor Feierstein or Dr. Smith or the ambassador?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to thank Professor Smith and Professor Feierstein. I think it has been a very interesting debate. There are many things to say. I think there is food for thought in many of the concepts that have been raised. What I can conclude is that still the fight for human rights, the fight against genocide, has to be an ongoing fight. There is still a big tension between sovereignty of states and this idea of universality. This has been the main tension in this field, and it was not solved. And in the last years, we see some ideas prevailing that put the idea of sovereignty and the nation first. But at the same time, there has been an idea of, through this R2P, this responsibility to protect, to use this idea of universality to promote invasions to countries, like it was mentioned by Professor Feierstein in the case of Libya. So we still have to try to build more neutral and stronger institutions in the international fields through multilateral cooperation. I see that this is the only solution, although imperfect and maybe with the possibility of failing in its purpose. But this is what, at least from my side, the side of governments or democratic governments and diplomacy, is what we try to achieve. We know that there are imbalances of power. We know that the decisions taken are sometimes biased, and there is a double standard in what we do. But still, I don't find another way of working in international politics that to try to strengthen the United Nations and its bodies. But well, this is how I see things, recognizing that these are quite imperfect solutions, but with time and with work and raising conscience everywhere, we can have the possibility of building a world with more justice and avoiding mass violations of human rights. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say to conclude, but I don't want to be the final speaker. Maybe others can say something else. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I agree with Ambassador D'Alotto. Of course, I'm in a country that is in the United Kingdom that is increasingly isolating itself at present. But there's never been a greater time to strengthen the multilateral institutions. 72 years on, some progress has been made, and we've had a fantastic overview from and challenge from Professor Feierstein, and thank you, Daniel, for your wonderful words and speech tonight. But there is so much more to be done, as we've been hearing and discussing, and we all need to play a role in that. It is important that the institutions are strengthened and at every opportunity. But there's also actions that we can all take as well, outside of institutions and outside of governments, in our own communities. And I'm reminded of that regularly when I hear stories from South Africa, from the Changemaker program, how individuals and communities can make a difference to build resilience against violence when these tidal waves of propaganda and hate media and misinformation sweep across unstable regions that are undermined already economically. That individuals can play a role in resisting that slide into excluding groups. And so I'm I'm very really pleased and proud to have really observed some of the programs that Tally helped us to get off the ground, and with Freddie, if he's still hearing, in Rwanda, or our colleagues in Rwanda. And finally, I just want to say thank you and a shout out to our colleagues at the Cape Town Holocaust Centre. I did see that Maya Osman and Marlene Silbert were on also earlier, and it's been a really great pleasure to work in partnership with you two over the years. So thank you all for being here. So I've spoken enough. Tally, I'm sure the final words for you.
I think Daniel, let you speak first.
Yeah, mainly thank you again, and I agree with both Ambassador D'Alotto and James. Just about that, of course, there is a tension between universality and sovereignty, and one of the challenges is how to manage that tension. I think the possibility is to strengthen the multilateral bodies and mainly to give them more autonomy. For example, one of the main problems of the International Criminal Court is its dependence over the Security Council. So we can't accept that in any democratic state, that we have the division of powers. So the judiciary power should have autonomy from the political power. So that's one of the main challenges. I know it is quite difficult, but that's one of the main problems in the international ways to deal with these judicial problems regarding human rights violations, that we need more autonomy from these bodies and more involvement from the social movements instead of the representative of states. So I think this is one of the main challenges, trying to manage how to deal with this tension, which I totally agree with Ambassador D'Alotto. And then, for example, we had a proposal from Brazil a decade ago, or maybe a bit more, regarding trying to balance the responsibility to protect with the responsibility while protecting. That was a project and a proposal by Brazil. It was quite interesting, trying to, who is controlling the people who are intervening, who is controlling what is being done in this kind of intervention. So I think that's very interesting ideas, trying to manage and balance and counterbalance these difficulties. But of course, I agree that what we need is more multilateral possibilities of cooperation and more social movements working on the field. And anyway, that's what we are trying to do. And regarding the COVID, the third element which is important, and we are working with you, Tally, in this group and this project, is how the pandemic could strengthen the different ways of projection and discrimination and hate in different countries, just trying to project this hate, this anger, this frustration regarding the death and the pandemic to different groups and minorities that are suffering in any country. So I think that's one of the main dangers of the current situation. So anyway, mainly, again, thanks to you and Aegis Trust and the Embassy for the invitation and for sharing this time with me.
So before I'll hand over to Kath to close, just to say it's wonderful to work actually tonight with partners. So Aegis Trust, James, Freddie, Mark, Nepo, all of you, longtime partners and doing fantastic work now in 12 African countries. Ambassador D'Alotto, the Argentinian embassy, worked with us so closely for years with exhibitions and films and events, and it's wonderful to work together. And I wish you a bon voyage when you are leaving South Africa and going to be the ambassador of Argentina in Switzerland. So this is an opportunity to say to you good luck, and we enjoyed working with you, and we hope to continue to be in touch with you. And Daniel, of course, thank you for always challenging us and being with you on the consortium on bigotry and hate. I learned from you that you will push us look at things in a different way. And I do appreciate that you didn't just wrap it today and say, oh, well done, 70 years of human rights, hippie hooray. But you said there are issues and we need to look at them, and inviting us to critically look at it and try to make the world a better place together through diplomacy, education, memory, but also activism. So I thank you all, and I hand over to Kath to just
Thank
close.
you, Tali. Thank you.
Kath, please close us for tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank everybody who's joined us tonight to make this webinar possible. Thanks again to the speakers and to all our partners from us at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And just to say that on Sunday, we're having another webinar, and this will be a panel discussion, really looking at restoration and reunion, and looking specifically at the restoring dignity to the Jewish cemetery of Novi Dvor. So that's at 7 p.m. on Sunday the 13th, and Jordan will put the link for that registration into the chat. But from us in Johannesburg, thanks again to everybody who joined us tonight, and I hope you have a very good evening. So good night.